Hello and welcome to this episode of The Brief. I'm your host, Meredith Reed. I'm here today with Daisy Soderberg Rivkin, a policy fellow in the Technology and Innovation Program at the R Street Institute, a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization based in Washington, D.C. Daisy's work focuses on online safety, encryption, and content moderation, drawing on knowledge and experience from her former career working as a content moderator at Google. Daisy has a master's degree from the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Welcome, Daisy.
Hi, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. So, as you know, at Spectrum, so much of the work we do and the products that we create relate to content moderation and how we can use AI solutions to make content moderators' lives easier. So our audience has varying levels of knowledge about content moderation. So can you just start by telling us, what is content moderation all about?
Sure. So content moderation is something that came about as tech companies were starting up, and any kind of platform that has user-generated content. So that would include platforms such as Facebook, such as Google, Twitter, any kind of social media really is going to have a lot of content moderation, and also even just regular websites. And content moderation is the act of kind of creating policies, usually company-wide policies, and following laws that would minimize what we would call harmful content. And harmful content can mean a myriad of things. But, things that we can think of is terrorism, child sexual abuse material, hate speech, defamation. And of course, the content moderation and decisions will vary based on what country the company is operating in, so which laws they need to comply with, as well as what policies they've developed internally to deal with this type of content.
So what does a day in the life of being a content moderator at somewhere like Google look like?
Yeah, it's I would love to say that it looks the same way every day, but every day is different. But essentially, what it looks like is the people who do content moderation have a variety of backgrounds. Some are lawyers, some have worked in public policy. I personally, when I was working there, had a bachelor's degree in political science, so I was kind of very aware of a lot of international issues and international law. And also I was fluent in French, and went to a French school, so I did a lot of the French market work. But usually how it would go is you would sit down in front of your computer, check your email just like any other person, look for anything that was marked urgent, right? So, and urgent messages could be anything from requests from government officials to police to, something from an executive at the company saying, this could cause some major PR problems. We need to deal with this. And then from there, you go into what we call a queue. So the cases flow in to the system and can be filtered out depending on the subject or depending on the language or depending on, the issue at stake. So it could be copyright, defamation, terrorism, child safety, et cetera, et cetera. So everything can be kind of cross-referenced as well. And depending on what you work on, what your particular expertise is, that's how you're going to be filtered out. And everything is kind of also labeled based on how old it is, where the source, who it's coming from, in those kinds of things. And you kind of go through them one by one as best you can. Now, along with that, in the back of your head, you have productivity goals. So as a content moderator, metrics is everything. And metrics is a lot in tech companies, generally speaking, but specifically for a content moderator, especially, it's very important. What that means is that you have a certain amount of cases that you need to complete every single day and every single quarter and every single month, there are time frames in which, you have to complete a certain amount of cases, and, you get rewarded if you do more, if you go above and beyond. And of course, you are spoken to if you are not meeting your productivity goals. But what that means also is that a case such as looking at a pile of dead bodies in a theater in France counts the same as a case of defamation where someone calls another person an idiot. So, and of course, our brains don't process those two types of cases the same way, as you can imagine. So that's something that you have to keep in the back of your head as well as you're going through these cases. But of course, sometimes you can't just force yourself to quickly go through a case that has such an emotional toll, but also has emotional impact depending on which decision you make, right? I've gotten messages before from, the mothers of victims of shootings, for instance, or, people asking you, why can't you just take all of this down right now? Those are very difficult things to deal with, not just as a content moderator, but as a human being. And so it makes it incredibly difficult. And as I mentioned before, that's really the core of what makes things change day to day.
Wow, that sounds like an incredibly difficult day to day at work. And it also sounds really challenging when your productivity goals are based on number of cases versus how serious they are. So has there been a push by content moderators to change the system of how you define productivity? Because I would think with certain cases, if they're not given the attention that they deserve, there could be very real and actually very real world danger, potential repercussions from that.
Yeah, there definitely has been a push. I think that internally, I personally have definitely made pushes before to management to kind of switch that over and kind of push the idea that, we're still human beings, we're not just numbers, right? And as such, we have very human responses to a lot of these cases. And as such, they can't be treated the same, right? Just by nature, also, cases that involve issues such as terrorism or child safety are a lot more complex, right? They're a lot more nuanced. They require a lot more discussion. And also, as you said, they have very serious consequences if not dealt with correctly. So, by nature, you need to take more time to analyze those types of cases. So there definitely has been push, and I left Google in 2017. So I'm sure that there has continued to be push to kind of change that. But I think the biggest push that we've seen as of late has been external. It's been because of work like the work of Casey Newton, who wrote the piece on Facebook content moderators and the conditions they were working in. And work from Sarah Roberts wrote a book about content moderation. There's been a lot more studies that are being made, a lot more attention to this issue, and very specifically, they talk about how a lot of these smaller issues are things that need to be changed as well. And I try myself to kind of bring it up as much as possible to kind of shed light on the importance of something that's seemingly kind of small, but really in the grand scheme of things can have a large impact.
So have you seen progress in the way that technology and AI, for example, can help with making the jobs of content moderators a little bit, I don't want to say easier because it's certainly not an easy job, but just helping you prioritize the types of things that you're spending your time on?
Yeah, 100%. I think AI has a very large role to play in content moderation. I think that I don't think that AI will ever completely replace human beings. I always think that human beings will always have to play some part in the content moderation process. But I think that AI is so essential in kind of removing a lot of the load that a lot of these moderators are taking on. And I also think that a lot of the work revolving around AI is also evolving and changing to better understand the complexity of the content in question, right? So, there are plenty of companies who claim to be working on AI, but kind of fail to look at certain contextual differences, for instance, or that put very I call them kind of black and white labels on things, whereas things are a lot more complex than that, as we know. And the only way you're going to understand that is by consulting with people who have done the work and understand that, what the differences are. And that just doesn't just mean content moderators. That could also mean, the engineers who train AI, for instance. They have to look at the content as well. So they have an understanding of this. And so I think that, slowly but surely we're moving to a point where AI can take on a lot of the load that content moderators are taking on. Now, from the side of content moderators and their conditions and how they're working, I still think that there's a lot of work to be done. And I think it's not just a question of changing conditions for content moderators and contractors in particular. It's about looking at the overall system, and there are a lot of challenges in the overall system, and kind of reprioritizing, your company organization, right? Kind of looking at rethinking how we deal with crises. And COVID-19 is a perfect example of that, right? Of, content moderators are so alienated from the rest of the company, right? So they just get the orders that trickle down. And, it takes too many steps for them to talk to the public policy people, to talk to the other, the engineering teams and all of that, so that they can understand why we're making these decisions. And, one thing that I've always said is that I really think that, they should organize content moderation teams and just teams that deal with kind of crises such as, terrorism, or we're talking about pandemics and things like that, by issue type, right? So you have public health crisis team, but that consists of moderators, public policy fellows, engineers, and public health experts who can monitor the situation, who know who to talk to. They can make algorithmic changes. They can then give concrete guidance to content moderators to do the work, because without that concrete guidance, that's how all these ad hoc decisions and mistakes are made.
That sounds like a powerfully effective way to go about addressing some of these issues. I mean, part of the internet is that everything changes so quickly, and there is no one size fits all moderation system. Exactly. You have to be quick to adapt, and also know when you need to bring in experts and people that are uniquely positioned to deal with certain types of content. So I think that's a really incredible suggestion. So going off of that, with the internet, there have been a lot of questions about who regulates this, where does government come into all of this? And I know that now some of the work that you're doing at R Street is related to all of this. So Can you start by telling us a little bit more about what R Street is and the type of work that you do there?
Yeah. So R Street is essentially a libertarian think tank. We work on a number of different issues, but mainly, I focus on technology. So we have a technology and innovation team, and then we have a national security and cybersecurity team. Often, as you can imagine, they overlap. So I kind of wear a bunch of different hats. I work on some encryption work. I work on child safety is my kind of main area of expertise with content moderation. And so we do just a ton of work on mostly working with Congress to kind of act as almost consultants on pieces of legislation, telling them, what issues could arise, what issues they should be aware of or look out for, and then also just educating them mainly on, the nuances, the complexities of different technologies. And as, someone who has industry experience, telling them, kind of acting as a bridge also between the private sector and the public sector, and being like, look at it from their perspective, look at it from their perspective, and not just playing one role as the, I'm going to defend only tech companies, I'm going to defend only the government. Is trying to wear all the hats, act as a bridge, making sure that people are hearing each other.
Right. I think that's such an important point, the type of work that you're doing. I read your article on sex workers, and correct me if I'm wrong, there was a bill that was widely supported and passed by legislators that seems good at first glance. It seems like something that's protecting sex workers by not letting them advertise services on various platforms, like let's say Craigslist, for example, but actually ended up putting them in harm's way. Could you talk a little bit more about that?
Sure. So the bills in question were FOSTA-SESTA. Those bills were originally implemented because of the kind of uptick in child trafficking specifically. And then that kind of just broadened into, trafficking and sex work, non-consensual sex work is what we're talking about. Sex trafficking is a real problem, and we need to get rid of it. And that was the main goal, right? Without kind of thinking of, different variants of that, right? So not all sex work is non-consensual. That's something that is the main idea that wasn't really thought of or considered when drafting this piece of legislation. As a result, when it was implemented, a lot of companies, just out of fear that they would be sued into oblivion and be buried in legal fees, Craigslist, for instance, just removed anything related to sex work. A lot of these message boards that existed that were completely just taken away, taken offline. And the problem with that is that in practice, what that also did is that when you look at those pages, it's not just, they're like prostitution, it is completely okay. If you're against prostitution, that's fine. But the fact of the matter is you have to acknowledge that a lot of these pages also have become, and the internet in general has become, a safe haven for a lot of these workers. And in order to avoid a lot of the dangers of consensual sex work, such as STDs, or people who might be dangerous or violent, or might try to kind of, or people who are pimps or going to try to sell you or try to kidnap you. Those types of dangers are pieces of information that are vital to a consensual sex worker in kind of, living their life, being safe, and, making a living. They too are just trying to make a living here. And this is just so happens what they do. So regardless of what your kind of moral outlook is on the issue, right? We are trying to protect the users and protect these people from actually becoming subject to a lot of the things they're trying to avoid with this bill in the first place, right? So that's something that often gets left out of legislation. That's kind of the bigger lesson here, is that when drafting legislation on technology, a lot of the time you have to ask yourself, who is this going to protect? Who is this, freedom from sex trafficking, but for who, right? Because another thing is that we see is, for example, with FOSTA-SESTA, is that it actually ended up hurting a lot of minority groups, and disproportionately hurting minority groups. And that happens a lot, is that, we forget about the people that this would actually, that are already marginalized, and this would further marginalize them. That's not usually the thought of the legislators. They think really on the surface of these tech issues, where it's like, but we're trying to protect the children, without thinking about how this is actually going to play out in practice.
Right. So just to explain that a little bit further for our listeners, it's my understanding that the reason that being able to post on the internet made it safer for consensual sex workers to do their work is because they were able to connect on these internet forums and share information. For example, if there was someone out there who was dangerous, who was abusive to sex workers, they were able to kind of flag those people online. It was like so many internet communities. It was a community of people in the same industry looking out for each other and, sharing information that was valuable to other people working in their industry. Is that correct?
That is correct. And it was also kind of an empowering mechanism because it allowed them to work for themselves as opposed to working for a pimp, for instance, right? They could screen their own clients, they could make their own connections without having to rely on a third party who might or might not lead them into a very dangerous life.
Right. And that's such an important point. So thank you for elaborating on that a little bit more. So what are the platforms like Craigslist, let's say, but any platform, what is their level of liability for the things that users say and do on their platforms? And I know there's no clear answer to this yet, and that's part of what you do for a job. I'm wondering how you determine where your right to moderate ends and where free speech begins.
Right. Whenever you ask a question like this, you are going to be hearing Section 230 quite a bit. So Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act is a law that was passed in order to shield companies from liability for user-generated content. And what that means essentially is that if I post something defamatory on Facebook, the person who I'm insulting will say, they did this on your platform, and so I'm going to sue you, Facebook. And Facebook will say, well, according to Section 230, you can't do that. You can't sue us. You have to sue the person who actually said this. So that is how that would work on the kind of simplest of levels. What that also means, though, is that there is the law also calls for good faith actions, which essentially means that even though that you are shielded from that liability, you still need to make an honest effort to minimize harmful content on your platform. And that turns into content moderation, right? That means having internal policies and complying with laws in order to make sure that a lot of this content doesn't appear or that it's minimized in general. Now, of course, that gets very complicated because every company has very different policies. And, you could say, and we're not just operating on First Amendment principles, right? Because if we were, then, there are a lot of things that are protected by the First Amendment that people don't realize are protected by the First Amendment. Nazi propaganda would be protected by the First Amendment. White supremacist content would be protected by the First Amendment. There's a lot of things that are protected by the First Amendment that are not protected by tech companies, so that they create their kind of own policies to minimize. So that's kind of where the free speech angle of this comes in, right? So when companies will say we are protecting free speech, I think a better way to put it is that we are protecting our concept of free speech. And their concept of free speech is usually developed through user feedback, through pressure from the government. It's a myriad of different things occurs that will change their policies over time. It'll change their policies day to day, even sometimes. They'll change based on what kind of crisis is hitting, like COVID-19 or like any kind of terrorist attack, those kinds of things. And so, as you mentioned, the reason why I basically have a job is because this is such an ongoing discussion on what it means. What is free speech? What should be and should not be allowed on these platforms, and who should decide? That's another huge question.
Right. I think another really difficult gray area is, I don't know if you remember, this was several years ago. There was a police officer, I believe, that was saying really disgusting, disturbing things about people and kind of his fantasies of murder. And do you know what I'm talking about? And it got flagged at some point, and then it was this really big case of can you actually press criminal charges against someone's essentially fantasies, even if you have a solid amount of information indicating that they had every intention of acting them out, but they didn't.
But they didn't. Yeah.
That's such a tough gray area. And
and those decisions, just to give you an idea for content moderators, that's the kind of decision they were expected to make in sometimes 15 minutes. It's something that, now there are certain cases that would be deemed, public relation risks, right? And those would be kind of escalated higher up, and you would kind of talk to an executive or someone, or the executive's assistant, whoever was available. And you would kind of talk it out, and they would say, this is high risk for us. We really need to deal with this now. But then there were a lot of other cases, just like the one you mentioned, where, I would be sitting in front of my computer and I would be like, I have to make this decision right now. And you can discuss it with your coworkers, you can discuss it with your manager, but ultimately the decision has to be made. And it's, moderators are wearing a million different hats, right? They're being expected to specialize and consider everything. I was 23 when I started content moderation. And while, I had a BA and I was an educated person, I was by no means an expert in terrorism or an expert in child safety or, anything like that, but was expected to make all these different decisions within a day.
Oh my gosh. I would think another really difficult thing would be determining if and when you should get law enforcement involved.
Yeah.
Especially when you only have 15 minutes.
Yeah.
So I want to talk to you a little bit about child safety, because that's something that we really care a lot about at Spectrum, and trying to deal with the intersection of children and technology. So you were initially hired to work at R Street on their child safety portfolio. Can you talk a little bit more about the type of work that you're doing with that?
Yeah. So I think that, especially recently, I think that it's come out a lot more. It's been highlighted a lot more that children are not safe online. I mean, there was a huge New York Times article that came out which said, child sexual exploitation is everywhere on the internet. How did we let it get this bad? What's happening? Who's to blame? Because that's a very common thing to do, is playing this blame game as to who's endangering children. And the easy answer for a lot of people, especially in Congress, but a lot of the public as well, is that tech companies are just not doing enough. And I think that to a certain extent, that's true. I think that there is a lot that can be done, and there's a lot of progress to be made within tech companies to kind of prioritize this work and to make sure that they are putting the right resources in the right places. But I think another thing to consider is that the child safety ecosystem is a lot bigger than people know or consider, right? So it's not just tech companies that deal with child safety issues, right? It's also the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, which is essentially the national clearinghouse for any online content that relates to child exploitation. But they also deal with missing children's cases, or the management of any cases related to child exploitation, domestic abuse towards children. So by law, technology companies have to report any content that they see on their platforms to this clearinghouse. And they have to analyze it, and they have to get any kind of information they can out of it to then write yet another report to law enforcement so that law enforcement can act. And law enforcement is both local, it's the FBI, Federal Bureau of Investigation. It's also these things called ICACs, which are Internet Crimes Against Children programs, which essentially were created to train local law enforcement to deal with these types of cases. And local law enforcement, let's remember, are also dealing with homicides, drug cases. They're dealing with all the other types of crime that you can imagine. So given the sheer volume, which is huge, this is all very overwhelming, as you can imagine, for all parties involved. And there are a lot of congressional funding issues related to this. The NCMEC, the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, as well as a lot of these law enforcement agencies, are severely underfunded, and they can't afford to get the resources, the personnel, the training that they need to actually deal with this. Another thing is that tech companies very often are asked to develop more AI, to kind of refine their AI to deal with child sexual abuse material. And yet there are a lot of legal barriers. I think a lot of people would be surprised to know that there are legal barriers for tech companies to actually perform this work efficiently. So for example, Section 2258AH, getting that right, of the US Code actually says that tech companies can preserve material, so child sexual abuse material, for 90 days before they completely delete it. So they have it for 90 days and then they completely delete it. And most people are like, yeah, what's the problem with that? Well, the problem with that is that if you're training AI to detect child sexual abuse material, you're going to need longer than 90 days. And the reason for that is because it's incredibly nuanced and complex material. We're not training AI to detect a banana from an apple. We're trying to, already it's difficult for human beings to look at some of these images, as someone who's looked at these images, and understand, is this person over the age of 18, younger than 18? How old are they? Is this consensual? Is this not consensual? Also, I've seen this before, just from my own personal memory. I've seen this image before. I know this person. A lot of those things have to be factored in, right? All the varieties, the different situations that can be established as child sexual abuse material have to be given to the system to train it in order to understand this. And it's not just images and videos, it's also words, right? It's also messaging. So when you're grooming a child to be exploited, a lot of that happens over Messenger, or it happens via email. And those are the types of things that need to be addressed as well. And that just doesn't happen in 90 days. So essentially what that means is that a lot of tech companies then, if they do keep it for more than 90 days, or they're really trying to use this to develop AI, they're technically working outside of the law. And that shouldn't be the case, right? They shouldn't be having to work outside the law to develop AI for this. So that's kind of one of the huge regulatory problems that we have, other than, just large funding problems. So all of this is what I work on, is essentially making sure that people understand how big this ecosystem is, and that everyone has a role to play and can make an impact in changing this, right? Not just tech companies. Congress has a lot that they can do as well, other than just playing the blame game.
Right. And I think that's where the work that you do in policy is so important, because, the natural tendency is to point the finger at the tech platform and point out their failure to protect. But what many of us don't realize is all of the restrictions and limitations that they have from the government and other places that kind of control what they are not able to do. And when everyone is spread so thin, it makes it even more challenging to really address these issues in a meaningful way.
Exactly.
So, can you also talk about the encryption work that you do? I know that you'd mentioned to me before we did this episode that you manage an encryption portfolio and civil rights in relation to encryption. So, could you talk a little bit more about the work that you're doing with that?
Yeah. So my biggest work on encryption has recently been in relation to a piece of legislation that came out called Earn It. So Earn It is a law that was introduced, and the reasoning for it was, again, let's protect our children. And that encryption, well, the thing is, it doesn't actually mention encryption, which is very funny. It doesn't mention encryption, but anyone who is an expert and knows this knows that this is something that's going to come up. But basically what it says is that, as we talked about Section 230 and how it protects companies, is that you have to, this commission, which would be headed by the Attorney General, William Barr, would develop quote, best practices in detecting and fighting online child sexual abuse imagery. And if tech companies don't follow those best practices, then they would lose their 230 immunity and suddenly would obviously be slapped with tons of legal fines, tons of lawsuits, and things like that. Now, in going through the bill itself, it becomes pretty clear to anyone who works in this space that one of these best practices will most likely be encryption. And the reason we say that is because of the Attorney General's history with encryption in general, right? So he, at one point, tried to use terrorism as a means for breaking encryption. And by breaking encryption, I mean creating these, quote, backdoors for law enforcement to be able to get information in order to pursue kind of these criminal investigations. And we saw that with San Bernardino and the iPhone case and things like that. Now, first of all, the biggest pushback to that is that there's no such thing as a backdoor just for the good guys, right? If you create a backdoor, you're creating a backdoor for anyone. And that could be law enforcement, but that could also be bad guys, right? And so that's something that has constantly been brought up and is absolutely right. But it's also thinking about encryption in general and who does encryption serve, right? So encryption is, yes, to a certain extent, it protects criminals, right? But at the same time, you remove encryption, right? Let's talk about a world where they get their way. Take down encryption. You can suddenly get at all this information. Now, first of all, criminals are not stupid. And I think some of them are kind of lower level, and that's fine. But if you're trying to get at the source, which if you talk to any FBI person, they're trying to get to the source of the child exploitation ring. They're not going to be doing this over WhatsApp or over a Facebook Messenger. Also, they can use their own encryption methods, right? That's something that is very common with these types of criminals, is that they can use their own encryption message. They can encrypt their own messages and their own files, and they don't need to rely on the encryption provided by a platform. Another thing is if you take off encryption, that also means that you're ironically putting kids at more risk, right? Suddenly you have no encryption and all of their data is up for grabs. All their information is up for grabs. These criminals can get at them if they want to. But also that means that encryption comes down on more than just these platforms, right? This is going to set a precedent to bring it down on many other platforms as well and other products, right? So, your camera in your home, your security camera could then be used to spy on your children or, things like that. It really is another case of not understanding how this is going to play out in practice and thinking about the motivations of the people who are creating this. And I think it's really important to understand how this is going to disproportionately also affect people who really rely on encryption, not just for the privacy of their data, but also the privacy of their safety, right? So that means people who are human rights advocates in countries that have kind of authoritarian rulers, or people who are being oppressed, people who want to come out and tell the world that their people are being slaughtered, or that there are gross human rights abuses in their country. These are things that also rely heavily on encryption. And this is something that a lot of the time is not thought about when creating this legislation. And that they appeal to a large number of people because they say, we're going to protect the children. And that's where I come in and said, what if I told you that they're not going to protect the children? What if I told you that this is actually going to put them in more danger, ironically, and not be as effective as you think it might be? So that has like been the huge work on encryption that I've been working on, is that, you know, it's an absolute insult to use children as a mechanism to get at this, and to think that people don't realize that is a little bit is kind of underestimating the intelligence of a lot of us. And so that's been my main focus recently.
Wow, these are incredibly vast issues, and I feel like I could talk to you about this all day. I have so many questions. I have so much.
Ooh, sorry.
Oh, no worries. Let's start this. We'll start this clip over. Wait, no, I don't remember what I was saying. Wow, these are really vast issues. There's so much to cover. There's so much to say. I would love to keep talking to you about this all day, but because we have to wrap this up somewhere, and because this episode in particular covered a lot of really heavy content, and our world is already heavy enough right now, let's try to glass half full this a little bit, and talk about the future. You obviously know a ton about these issues, and also effective strategies to make some of these issues better. So I want to ask you if you could give 3 things we could do as a society to do a better job of advocating for healthier and more effective content moderation methods, what would they be?
Sure. I think number 1 would be transparency. Make sure that, and this is not just for tech companies, it's also for Congress. You know, I think that we need to make sure that people understand why decisions are being made. We are serving the public, we're serving the user base, and they need to understand why things are happening. They shouldn't be happening in a black box anymore. That's number 1. Number 2 is making sure that we shed more light on the importance of content moderation, and making sure that people understand what part content moderators play, and therefore why they need better treatment. And by better treatment, I mean, if you break down exactly what they do, they're basically first responders of the internet, and as such should be provided with the same resources and benefits and treatment as those who are full-time, right? So contractors and full-time employees should really be treated the same way in this type of work. And I think the last thing would be to have a healthier moderation system. I think we need to work not just on response, but work on resilience. And resilience meaning making sure that we're building a stronger tech immune system to a lot of these crises, and not just kind of take them as they come.
Thank you so much for sharing that. I think those are all really valuable and great recommendations. So Daisy, thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you for having me.
And we will see you next time on The Brief.